Hello, everyone. Hi, welcome. It is 2:30, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I saw a lot of people responded and accepted the invitation. A lot of folks I haven't seen in a while, so welcome. Do want to apologize for the misfirings of notifications earlier if you experienced that. Just moving on, though, I am Gordon. I've been in knowledge management for, I don't know, about 5 years. And that doesn't make me an expert in knowledge management, but it has given me the opportunity to work with about 100 different clients. I'm getting a message that my audio is off. Let me see what I can do here. Okay, all right, so it sounds like it's okay. So what I was saying is that I've been afforded the opportunity to see how a lot of really complex organizations manage knowledge. And overall, the trend that I've seen is that while organizations invest a lot of money in retaining knowledge, they aren't very good at knowledge recall. And a lot of that has to do with the complexities of natural language processing. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and kind of cover what I intend to go over today, which is just a discussion to start with on whether or not natural language tools are important, and then following that, what the key challenges are that have been stunting the growth of natural language processing in business. We're going to talk a little bit about how it works, so the technology behind it, how it can be used, how it should be leveraged, and then just carved out a little bit of time at the end to give you a demo of our platform, which does natural language processing and returns answers, because that's what NLP enables, is the ability to return answers. So our natural language tool is important, yes. They are. Natural language, obviously, is how we communicate on a daily basis. It's how we structure our ideas. It's how we communicate to coworkers. We all have different questions in our daily lives that are answered through NLP. But when we're talking about business questions, it's very different. The complexity and the depth required for enterprise use is a really big lift for most technology. And just to set the stage, because I don't know how familiar everyone is, when we talk about natural language, we're talking about just speech. But around those technologies, you've got natural language processing, which is NLP, and you've got NLT, which is natural language technologies. And they encompass a lot of different applications, but in the realm of business, enterprise, natural language tools, we're really talking about processing. We're talking about processing ideas and delivering answers and understanding the context behind what the question is. Because in our daily lives, when we're asking questions, especially the types of questions that you ask Google, Siri, Alexa, it's very broad knowledge. There's that knowledge applies to everybody. So when the New York Knicks win, they win across the board. Nobody has a different experience. There's no nuance to it. There's a winner and there's a loser. And so when you're talking about open domains, because the concepts spread so far across kind of a shared source of truth, it's a lot easier for tools to be able to return answers and understand the questions you're asking, because there isn't a lot of variation. There is variation, but there's not a lot of variance in what you're going to ask. You're going to ask them to play music. You're going to ask them to turn on and off your lights. They're in terms of the types of questions they ask or answer that you're able to ask, it's fairly limited. But when you get into business questions, you really have to go deep, because it's not the same universal set of information. It's not the same universal set of knowledge. And a lot of times a word or a phrase or an idea applies differently from one industry or one business unit or one division or one team to another. And so for a natural language tool to be able to understand that, it really has to go deep into your domain. And when we talk about domains, what we mean is your role, your function, your purpose, the expertise around the subject that the questions or the challenge or the struggle is. So in the case of a broad search tool like Google or Siri or Alexa, the domain, so to speak, is like pop culture. It's news, it's current events, it's sporting events. But when you're talking about in business, the types of domains that you have to be able to understand, or the natural language tools or technology has to be able to understand, it's much more wide-ranging, and it's supported by a lot of different, it's supported by a very diverse set of applications. And it's very popular to think that, you can have one ring to rule them all, but it just doesn't work. Different tools need different solutions. Your sales team is never going to be able to use Jira to manage your sales cycle, and your engineering team is never going to be able to use Salesforce to manage their ticket troubleshooting. As much as each company is going to tell you it's possible, the truth is there are tools that are built to support very specific needs and functions. And in addition to that, in terms of querying information, you have to know where users are going to put it, because one user might put their notes on OneNote, one might put it on Evernote, one might put it in a Word document and save it to their computer. And so understanding how to access the data, where to access the data, what data is important, is a much more difficult task for an LP in an enterprise, business, commercial, professional sense. And those challenges with the data that we're talking about, that we're struggling with applying natural language to, are creating problems in the organization. Because what happens is the folks who are experts in your organization have the knowledge, they know where to find it, they know how to update their knowledge, they know where to find the sources of their expertise. But when they leave, or when they get promoted, more importantly, it's very hard for that information to be retained through that turnover cycle. And so that knowledge loss creates knowledge scarcity. And that knowledge scarcity creates a competition. It also creates a burden for the people who are moving on or moving up to constantly have to retrain, retool, reskill, where a tool would be much better to service those needs. And there's also a social component to it, because you don't always want to be asking the same person the same questions or similar questions all the time, because you understand that they have a role as well. And so what that does is it pushes you away from your coworkers to some extent, and it pushes you onto platforms. It pushes you onto keyword creation exercises. It pushes you onto search results where you have to click on links, dive down the page, use Control F, and that results in a lot of time loss. And it doesn't just result in a lot of time loss, it results in exhaustion. People get tired, people move on without answers. It's just not an easy exercise to find answers to your questions. And as insane as it is, it can be as simple as like, what is a policy for inviting a guest on campus, right? Because that's changed over the last year. There was a pre-COVID policy, there was a COVID policy, now there's a post-COVID policy. So how do you know where to find the documents, what particular platform it's on? You really have to be pretty tech savvy. And requiring that kind of knowledge, requiring that kind of savviness is not scalable. You have to train your workforce, you have to continue to maintain it. And at the end of the day, this this problem of not being able to get simple answers to simple questions the way that you can. You can ask Siri, what are the airplanes that are flying over my head right now? And she can answer that question, but I can't get a straight answer about the vacation policy out of my business platform. And it's insane. And the reason this becomes such a problem and such an inhibitor to your business is because we don't live our lives in rows and columns. And there are solutions out there that solve that problem, that really dig deep. And they're kind of household business names now. Tableau, for example, they became unicorns, Snowflake. All of these platforms that are designed to help you gain insights into your business have kind of become all the rage now, but it only addresses 20% of your data. The reality is that we live our life in narratives, and those narratives are pushed through presentations, they're pushed through Word documents, they're pushed through chats, they're pushed through social intranet posts, maybe your website, maybe your competitors' websites. And keeping up with all of that information becomes absolutely impossible because there's important information, it's varied, it's diverse, the concepts are all related to each other, they're a whole of each other or a part of each other. And so really getting down and finding answers to really what should be straightforward business questions becomes that very familiar kind of hamster in a wheel moment, right? Where you're in a meeting, there's a piece of information that you need in that meeting that's strategically important, and you can't access it. No one in the room knows it off the top of their head. So someone says, "Oh, what was our competitor's capex? What assets do we have that were delayed by weather?" And if you don't know those questions off the top of your head because they're in a file somewhere or in a daily shift report that you just haven't read, it then becomes your job to go find the answer. So you could ask a colleague. And what strikes me, having spent time in knowledge management, is that this is now the fad. It's no longer how do we find answers, how do we get the relevant document. It's, to a certain extent, it's how do you find the person with the answer instead of trying to find the answer in the documents. At Jive, we had a product called People Graph, and People Graph was going to do this. It was going to help you when you ask a question, admitting that that search was probably not going to be that effective. Here, go ask this person because this person is going to be your SME for this role. Now, you can ask a colleague, you can find an answer that way. If you do, jackpot, good for you, because otherwise you have to go onto the platforms. And by the time you find your information, if you find your information, because that is a threat here, is that people just move on without the data, it's no longer relevant. It's no longer timely. The other people aren't in the meeting. It can't influence the decision-making of the room and the brainstorming. So you lose 90% of the value of that answer after the fact, and you have to spend a lot of resources getting it. And the fact is that if those answers were more available, you would be able to contribute more to your organization. It's really interesting how powerful shared knowledge is. There was an article by HBR that talked about the importance of opening up your sales information to non-sales teams. So essentially what it argued was that your sales team is hoarding, quote unquote, client information, direct client feedback that could influence operations, it could influence leadership, that could influence product, that could influence all support, that could influence every element, every aspect of your business, and it's in a CRM somewhere. And if you open that information up to the rest of your business, people are going to be able to contribute in ways that you typically would not expect from someone at either their level or their function or their role to be able to create a better experience across the organization, regardless of position. So it allows people, if you will, to lead from where they are. And when we do our ROIs, we aren't quite as aggressive as HBR. They say that if you implement a tool like natural language processing or a QA platform, essentially getting answers to your employees in a more efficient way, they say that you are going to increase your revenue by 30%. Now, what we say is that there are different elements of impact depending on how you're using Nesh and what insights people are able to pull from the platform. And so that is going to be a variable gain. So depending on how you use Nesh, you can expect different impact across your business, and each element has a different value of contribution that can be improved through employee engagement on something like Nesh. So I'm sure at this point, all of you are asking, well, all right, if it's that common, if it's that obvious, if it's that impactful, surely I would have NLP at work. Clearly, we don't have it because it's not that impactful. Well, the issue is that the lift is big. And, we talked about this a little bit earlier in the presentation, but the depth required in a enterprise application for natural language question answering is very deep. And there are three components that complicate the experience or the rollout or the ability to deliver on these elements. And one of them is the ability to handle the relationship between operators and objects. So you've got who, what, when, where, how, but that the impact of those phrases or ideas change in relation to and or neither, between, all of, and part of, and answering that, addressing that, teaching a computer to be able to understand the nuance in those questions to deliver professional answers is incredibly difficult. Not to mention that the natural language that we use in business is wholly different than the natural language that we use in our private lives, because in business, we're talking about model numbers, serial numbers, release batches. There are very technical elements of language that we use that are not universal to all of us. Typically, when you're using natural language, it has to be universal language, like sports and games and basketball, because that means the same thing to everybody. But when you're talking about release 1.1.5, that could mean different things to different parts of your organization, because you could have different product sets and each of them are on different versions. And so the ability to understand the particular piece of information that you have in front of you that you're trying to understand is complicated by context and by relationships between between entities, assets, ideas, and language. But even if you can nail that, you also need an understanding of industry. You need to understand what kind of acronyms, synonyms, what kind of industrial language that is maybe applicable to a larger subset of a culture, but is not universal to the wider population. And then to be able to iterate that over different departments and business units becomes, for a computer, very hard to separate out. And that has really limited the ability for natural language processing tools to address problems, because instead of solving for X, we have figured out a combination of workarounds that allow us to still deploy a solution and really, frankly, only get 20% of the way there. And the issue is, and I'm going to just really quickly talk through some of these issues and the workarounds, right? So you got, when we were talking about object operators, relationships between and or but neither, what a traditional search engine has done, or question answering system they've eliminated the operator, and they've used predictive analytics to analyze speech patterns in text, whether it be scraped or through API or whatever the delivery method is, and it then tries to index that information through predictive analytics and text. Well, that doesn't solve the problem, because the operator really matters. When you're asking for a who, you want a person. When you're asking for a what, you want an it. When you're asking for a when, you want a time. And so removing those operators or de-emphasizing those operators becomes a real issue when it comes to getting answers. It's great for a technical band-aid. It allows you to move on to other challenges and release a technology, but as a user, it really affects the efficacy of search. In terms of context and concepts, we have synonyms and acronyms. And on the whole, synonym and acronym dictionaries work. They don't have an ability to understand your industry, function, location relationships between concepts, but you're able to say, okay, for us, AWS means Amazon Web Services. And so when someone searches for Amazon Web Services, boom, they find articles on AWS as well. So we're able to do. The problem with that is that it's not extendable over team. It needs to be individually managed. Functions are going to complicate this. So as soon as the scope starts to grow, synonym acronym dictionaries become very hard to manage, and really an effort in and of themselves to maintain and define. When you take those two things into consideration, then it makes scaling a solution very hard. You can use applications like Watson, like Azure Cognitive, like Kendra, to answer very specific questions, but it takes time and energy to train an AI or a machine to understand those things. So it's a knowledge dump. Humans have to train the computers to understand things. And we all know how difficult it is to work with computers. And so training a computer requires technical savvy, as well as that subject matter expertise, as well as the patience to wait for the computer to figure it out. And so those challenges have really hamstrung the natural language infiltration into your business, because frankly, everybody should have a little virtual assistant for their business in their company, like Clippy. Remember Clippy? That you can just ask questions and get answers. But the reality of it is the complexity of business questions and the lack of technical answers to these three core issues has hamstrung the ability for those tools to take off. That isn't to say that there aren't a lot of folks trying to solve these problems. There are. You will see, recognize Microsoft, Google, IBM, obviously leaders. You've got Elastic in here. IHS Market, I think we're all familiar with them. LucidWorks, Mindbreeze. The issue is that while these engines do provide a lot of advantage over just a typical search engine that you would find in say a Jive or in your Team Connect or in your EPS or whatever, you are also going to find that natural language is a problem for almost all of these solutions. Natural language is a workaround. You tend to take these patterns that we talked about earlier and you apply them to the metadata and the tags that exist. So what's happening is that these predictive analytics are being applied in your question as well as in the answer, and it's the platforms are trying to make a connection, and it makes it very weak. And while Nesh has a little bit of ways to go, we have an ability to execute, and we've brought that ability to make it a little bit more accessible. But in general, the solution providers out there have to make a decision between going deep and going wide. And this is a general XY axis of where you find the providers when you're talking about natural language search, when you're talking about enterprise insights. Tools like Google, tools like Elastic, tools like Kendra, they try to index and understand as much as possible through their knowledge graphs. And those knowledge graphs try to light up when it makes sense, but when you have very specific questions, it'll trigger general responses from the knowledge graph. And I know it sounds really weird, but that's kind of how it works. When you go deep, the issue is that while you can't get answers to specific domain-centric questions, IBM Watson was able to tackle medical use cases, and that's just about as complex as it gets. It's not easily scalable. So that medical use case has to be supported by doctors and engineers and Watson experts, whatever, coding experts, to be able to stand it up. But then to move it over to, say, a retail use case or over to an oil and gas use case, that's a whole different team, and it's a whole different effort, and it's a whole different implementation. And it doesn't allow for marginal gains, right? But now today, we have an ability to leapfrog that. And please forgive the shameless plug here, but with our automated domain understanding, our ability for Nesh to learn the way you learn. If you have an employee handbook, you learn about the employee handbook. Same with Nesh. If you want her to know about your employee handbook, you hand her the employee handbook. She reads the employee handbook, and you can answer the questions right then and there in an easy way that is updated continuously when updates to the handbook are made. And so those are the types of advantages that you have now that allow you to really index your audience to the whole spectrum of tools that your business uses that they're not going to move through. So from a user experience, you're going to ask a question and you're going to get an answer, but there's a lot of technology here in the back end that's behind the magic carpet, that's doing a lot of work. So what does it look like? How do you get questions? Well, it really depends on the questions that you're asking. When we think about questions, we're going to bucket those questions into a couple of different categories for sake of understanding how Nesh can be used. So you have commercial insights. These are things like what is the market doing? What kind of what are the things that my competitors are saying? What are the new things that we're learning? As well as internally, what do my proposals look like? What are the contract termination requirements for this contract or that contract? You also have an element, you also have another bucket, which is business continuity. And business continuity not only is about turnover and promotion, but it's also about time zones. So if you're operating in multiple time zones, you really shouldn't suffer because your time zone is different than the SME. For example, you're in London and they're in LA, so you can't get an answer. There ought to be a way for you to access that knowledge without having to wait for that employee to wake up. And finally, the final bucket, which I think is the easiest to understand, is knowledge support. Knowledge support is what is the threshold for this widget? What is the next step in the process? It's SOPs, FAQs, really static knowledge in your business that you need on a day-to-day basis to operate. So with that context, I'm going to jump into the demo. The demo is going to be a use case. So just because I think it's important to understand, Nesh is trained to answer specific questions for specific uses. And so when we talk about Nesh, we emphasize that that especially this implementation was built for a marketing use case for a power company. So they're looking at competitor moves. They're trying to understand the industry. They're trying to understand the market. And so that's what Nesh has been trained to answer here. I should point out that Nesh is a credentialed system. You come in, you log in, and Nesh understands who you are. If you have access to a certain set of documents or a server, for example, then she will know that. In terms of what Nesh is connected to, you can always understand what tools or what platforms or what information is feeding the Nesh atmosphere that you're querying. So here you've got regulatory information, you've got investor material. These are driven through API, so is the market research. The industry news, a lot of this is scraped off of websites. And then we have the ability to email Nesh or to drop Nesh into a central little drag and drop box. And so we've uploaded some Excels and PDFs, so you can understand where the information is coming from. You have a very simple UI. If you know how to use Google, then you should be pretty comfortable using Nesh. So I'm going to go ahead and just start off by asking Nesh a question, which would be relevant to this particular implementation. This company might want to know what their competitors are saying about green hydrogen. So you can ask a question, what are electric utilities saying about green hydrogen? While Nesh is indexing and updating and finding the answer, let's also ask a question about to Google. So Google, the experience you have here is SEO. There are no ads, but then they're asking questions that aren't mundane to what you're trying to figure out. And what are they saying about green hydrogen? Well, you have a lot of analyst articles. And those analyst articles might tell you what one or two is saying, but you have to jump into each one of them and read them. Nesh, on the other hand, allows you to get a direct answer to your direct question. Now, this natural language element is really important to understand. So Nesh is understanding the ideas and concepts of green hydrogen and electric utilities as entities. So Nesh, as a natural language engine, and with the understanding of your domain, your role, your function, your industry, the purpose that you are using Nesh for, she's going to call out these concepts as entities. So you've got electric utilities here, you've got green hydrogen here. When you're looking at the actual answer, this is your answer card. What are electric utilities saying about green hydrogen? Well, San Diego Gas and Electric is saying that building out the green hydrogen sector could offer different challenges and opportunities for the U.S. In addition to the primary answer that Nesh thinks is the most relevant to your question, you also have the ability to scroll through answers. And you'll see here that AES, as an electric utility, is saying we consider ourselves to be well positioned to be a leader to incorporate green hydrogen if and when it becomes economic sometime in the future. You can cross-reference that document. This is an earnings call. If it's a website, it would pop out the website. You can use filters to get to any kind of answer you want, including sentiment. Are they being negative, positive, etc.? And if you, for example, wanted to just see what Nextera is saying, you can see here this emissions-free project will utilize solar energy to create green hydrogen to power the fuel cells. So they've got a pretty ambitious project in the works for green hydrogen. So if you're not working on it, maybe it's worth considering it. That would be the general takeaway from this question. So that's the idea, is that by using NLP for business applications, you can get answers to your questions. And now NLP is at a state where if you're asking an object, if you have an operator, for example, like what, and saying, right, and about, she's going to be able to say, okay, well, you're looking for a quote, or you're looking for an action, or you're looking for some indication from these operators that they're either positive or negative about green hydrogen. When we change the question, for example, away from a what are people saying, so a quote or an opinion or a sentiment, and we change the question to an object like what assets are vulnerable to cyber attack. This is a very timely topic. A lot of people are concerned about this. The overriding answer here is that our assets and the information technology systems on which they depend could be direct targets of cyber attacks. Now, you can also see here as you scroll that she will find an answer in this document that says generation, transmission, and distribution facilities. So Nesh understands, or natural language, excuse me, understands the objects now at this stage of the technology cycle to be able to relate the object of the question to an object and an answer and give a direct answer to the question that you're asking. In addition, when you are evaluating, for example, maybe new markets to move into, new projects, new initiatives, you're going to have questions about the market segment. So, for example, you may ask a very specific question. So you're not asking about what is wind power. You're not asking about what are people saying about it, but you're asking a very specific question about the growth trajectory of the wind market, which, by the way, isn't the market for wind. It's the market for wind energy in India, which is a specific region. You ask her that question, and Nesh is going to bring back an answer that reflects the complexities of the question. And she's going to understand that you're not asking about air, you're asking about wind energy. And so what she's going to tell you is that India has more than 7 states where wind farms can be set up, and it suits the climate to the wind farm. It has been growing at a skyscraping rate. So that's a direct answer to your question. It's been growing at a skyscraping rate. So yes, the wind market in India is growing. It also talks, by the way, there's a little bit of a nuance added here to this card, which I think I should probably address, which is that while you can come down here and search your answers and then find the answer right on the website here, you can't reference, actually you can reference it here, but this is an AI answer. So she has compiled this based on this document. And so she is also referencing the projects because you're asking about it growing. So new projects, expanding projects is pertinent to your answer. So she's trying to find as concise of an answer as possible to the question that you're asking. So there are a lot of new applications that can be tackled with NLP in business. And while this particular application is for external sources like Reuters, the news and markets, SEC documents, that kind of thing, a majority of the use cases for NLP in business are actually internal. And I'm going to kind of address that with a couple of success stories to show you areas and applications in which this new scalability of NLP has been able to address new problems in new ways. But I want to emphasize here how mature NLP has gotten and a reason why, if you've been turned off on it in the past, you really should take another look at it, is that you can ask a question in very colloquial language. For example, what is a deal with solar? We all know what that means. What that means is, what's up with solar? Right? What's going on with solar? What's the new news in solar? What is the overall sentiment of solar? Now, for a computer to understand this is atypical. because deal isn't used in a way that typically in businesses it would be used, which is like a deal, close a deal. But she's understanding what you're asking, and the response is that solar is now seen as a low-risk asset capable of steady returns. That is a direct answer to a direct question. And so even when we're addressing very complex issues and topics and language and even semantic differences in, say, how people in the Northeast speak and people in the South, people out West, Nesh isn't going to encounter those kinds of issues because the NLP technology that exists today with domains, with the intersection of the automated ontologies that we have, and the ability to understand piecemeal bits of operators and objects, we're able to return very complex answers to very complex questions, as simple as they may seem, because really the more simple a question is, the harder it is to answer. What is the situation with this contract, with this supplier in this region that's expected to close in this date? That's a very specific answer. But when you go broad, computers tend to get confused. And as you can see now, technology that is built into the intersection of NLP, domain understanding, and question answering enables businesses to answer very difficult questions. So that's NLP. That's the new way of getting answers in business that is obviously much more efficient than what we're used to seeing with endless search, Control F, etc. And the trick here is that Nesh can be used to answer almost any question you have in your business. You'll find that NLP is highly applicable because everyone in your business uses it. We all build answers. We all build decks. We all build code. We all talk. We all answer questions. We all go on social platforms. We're all chatting. We're all slacking. Everyone uses natural language, and insights and answers are contained in every interaction that we make with our peers. And the ability to now collate that information, index that information, dig deep and understand that information allows for a wide variety of use cases to be applied for your business, to the advantage of your business. And one really good use case example that shows the flexibility and capability of natural language is kind of just taking you back earlier in the presentation to being in a meeting and an answer coming up and nobody having the answer to that question, that answer now no longer being pertinent or relevant or part of an asset that can be strategically added to a decision-making process. We had a client who had what they called asset morning meetings. And these were the leaders of their business getting together to break down the status reports for the assets that they manage. And usually they manage wide regions of assets like the Gulf of Mexico or the Permian Basin. And so they had a lot of assets under their management. And when they went to find answers during these meetings, very typical questions would come up, like which assets experience weather delays, which assets need to be repaired, which assets experienced a spill. The answers to those questions were contained in daily shift reports that were submitted by third-party contractors. And these third-party contractors, there was no standardized report. There was no way to get that information into the business in a uniform way. They would submit their reports in the way that they structured it. Then they were contracted with a bunch of different oil companies So they used that and they sent that out to a bunch of different people. And so they had so many different formats for these documents, and going and finding the answers or insights in them was just impossible, because the answer wasn't ordered. Like, was there a weather event? No, it was just a narrative, like we talked about, because that's how we live, is in narratives. And they implemented Nesh to answer these questions on the fly during those asset morning meetings. And they reported an accuracy rate of 90 to 95%. And that ability to return those answers in line is a profound improvement to the existing method, which didn't even ensure an answer. I mean, we're talking about questions that sometimes people would just give up after looking for an hour, 15 minutes, hour, 45 minutes. We've all been there. At some point we say, you know what? It's not worth it anymore. It's not that question is not that valuable. Nesh was answering every question and able to answer every question at 90 to 95%. So the capability of natural language to impact your business, even on important interdepartmental issues, is very realistic. And I would urge you to learn more about natural language processing for work. The implications could be profound in terms of the rewards that you're able to reap. I know we've been monitoring the Q&A, and this unfortunately isn't a good forum for us to have a back and forth conversation, but I will take those questions that have been submitted. Appreciate the engagement. It's been really good to see those questions coming in. I know it's been a good audience. I'm getting messages on my phone too, so I'm very excited about the fact that maybe this was valuable to you. I look forward to having a conversation with you about NLP in the future. Of course, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or on whatever platform you'd like. Reach out to Nesh. HelloNesh.io is our website. My contact information is listed right here. So you can get in touch with me. You can text me. You can call me. Let's have a conversation. I am passionate about NLP. I really think that this is the next stage in technology for knowledge management, knowledge retention, and knowledge recall, most important, which is the most difficult element of corporate knowledge is recall. I think we've all perfected the ability to hold on to that information for legal purposes, for e-discovery. But so long as you're spending those millions of dollars to retain it, take a look at NLP, get yourself an answer engine. Let's have a conversation about it. Just very excited that you attended. Thank you for your time. And we'll look forward to catching up in the future.